So there's a slideshow. I hope you're not too bored or distracted, but we'll see. First point is, and if you don't remember anything else about my presentation, this is probably the one to remember, is that closed session, meetings are presumed to be open under the Brown Act. So if you want to have a closed session meaning the public is not invited to the closed session, you have to have a reason for doing it. Not only do you have to have a reason for doing it, you have to have a specific statutory exemption that allows you to do that. So you have to have the permission of the Brown Act to have your closed session. So if you don't remember anything else, don't have a closed session unless there's a specific Brown Act exemption to allow you to do that. Your agenda, Mr. Farley was talking about agendas. You should always list on your agendas your closed session items. If the closed session item is not on the agenda, you probably don't want to have the closed session. You run back into the problem about having an item about discussing a matter that isn't on your agenda to begin with, and you've got the additional item of, well, you didn't list your reason for having that item in closed session. And just, I saw a lot of hands raised from memorial districts, community service districts. How many of you also have acted or are acting as the board secretary or work on preparing minutes? Is anybody out there? Yeah, that's what I thought. So you're the ones that actually put the agendas together, and you have to list when you have to have a closed session item. You have to list the reason for the closed session. So before you put it on the agenda and before you post it, you want to go back and you want to check to make sure that you're listing the right reason and that you're listing a reason that's allowed under the Brown Act. So always remember, if there's a closed session item, always be sure to double check what that exemption is and whether the purpose of your item meets the exemption. And we'll try to go into a little more detail on that. Just in general, if you think something should be a closed session item, that doesn't necessarily mean it is a closed session item. The Brown Act does not care about your feelings. So if you think, oh, that's embarrassing, we need to have that in closed session, that's not a valid reason for closed session. You want to find the specific statute that allows you to have a closed session item. So remember, Brown Act does not care how you feel. And then the consequences, that's what's the worst that could happen to me? Well, you could get arrested. Chances are that won't happen, but the big problem is the action could be voided. A lot of the closed session items come up because of personnel decisions, litigation decisions, and something that always comes up is, well, did the board act properly when it authorized, when it terminated this employee or when it authorized this lawsuit to be filed? And if the answer is no, then the termination can be voided, the lawsuit can be thrown out, and you have to start all over again, which can just be time consuming and it can kind of kill whatever it is that you're trying to do really before it even gets off the ground. So you always want to make sure you have all your procedural boxes checked correctly and that you've listed the right reasons, you got listed on the agenda correctly, and then going back, you've got your agenda posted correctly. So you just got to make sure. The Brown Act's a very procedural, fill in the boxes. Are we doing are we following the book? And you just always have to make sure that you're going back and you're doing what's permissible. So the potential consequences could be getting the item thrown out. Where do I go to find those exemptions? And the answer is the Brown Act. For those of you that are acting as secretaries, or for those of you that aren't acting as secretaries yet, because if you're on a small board, sooner or later, eventually you probably are going to have to, you want to look in the California Government Code to find those closed session exemptions. And the other big thing that you're going to want to know is you're going to want to know the safe harbor language. That's the language that the Brown Act authors have said. If your agenda item follows this pattern for a description of a closed session item, then you're okay. So you always want to look up those safe harbors. You want to follow that format. And I've got some descriptions later on of what the major items are. But you want to look at those safe harbors and make sure your agenda matches the safe harbor language. And then there's also some other specific closed session exemptions. The sections that I cited up on this slide are kind of the major ones that I'm going to go over. There's other ones, for if you're certain types of specialty districts, you've got your own special exemptions for specific circumstances that I'm just not going to get into. Most agencies don't qualify. The first big one is a personnel exemption. Sooner or later, everybody is going to wind up having to do some kind of personnel decision, and a lot of them are fun personnel decisions, whether or not you're going to hire somebody. Other ones are not so fun. But you are allowed to have a closed session for personnel decisions, whether you're going to hire, whether you're going to fire, whether you need to do a job performance evaluation. That's all very logical. That's something that should be done and exclude the public, just the board members, so that they have an opportunity for an open, frank discussion over what they want and what they're expecting from the personnel. Where it gets a little tricky is if you're discussing a specific complaint or allegation or a specific misconduct charge. In other words, if you're having to act as somebody is saying that employee A was sleeping on the job, and because you're a small district and there isn't anybody else, you, the board, are going to have to decide whether or not that employee was sleeping on the job. In that scenario, you're dealing with a specific complaint or a charge against an employee. So before you hold that closed session item, you're going to have to provide that employee with notice and a description of the charge to give them their due process, and you're going to have to provide that to them at least 24 hours in advance of your meeting. That's in addition to the agenda requirements. So you still have to have your agenda posted, you still have to have the closed session listed on the agenda, and you still have to have the closed session listed on the agenda the correct way under those safe harbor provisions. In addition, if it's a personnel issue and you're discussing a misconduct claim, you have to give that employee written notice at least 24 hours in advance. Then the employee can decide whether or not they want to have that charge heard instead of a closed session. They may want to say, no, if you're going to talk about this complaint, I want to have it heard in open session. That's up to the employee. That's the employee's call. If the employee says, no, I'm okay with closed session, you can continue with closed session. And the other part where the personnel exception can come up sometimes is some boards, if they have a contractor, they may want to hold a meeting about the contractor under personnel exemption. Under the personnel exemption, that's not correct. If it's a contractor, they don't qualify as an employee. Their contractors and employees are separate. So if you've got an issue with a contractor, you can't hold a closed session item to discuss that contractor under the personnel exemption. Now, there could be other exemptions, like litigation, if you think he's violating a contract, but you don't want to use the personnel exemption to discuss contractors. And then the other item has to do with labor negotiations. I don't know if anybody's got having to do with labor unions, but if you are, there is an exemption that allows you to have a closed session meeting to meet with your labor negotiator who's going to be meeting with the union rep. And in order to do that, you have to appoint the person that's going to be negotiating for you on behalf of the union, and you have to have that appointment done. And then the board can meet with that negotiator in closed session to give updates and to discuss the terms of the contract with the union. Next is litigation. Now, first point, and I don't want to be a sales pitch, but you need to have an attorney present if you want to use the litigation exception. You can't say, we're going to meet under litigation because we think we can get sued, and then you meet without your attorney. The purpose of the closed session item for litigation is for public agencies to meet with their attorney. So, in order to do that, you have to actually have the attorney in the meeting. Now, the attorney doesn't have to be physically present. The attorney can be available by teleconference, and unlike the whole issue with the voting, where you have to have specific things under the agenda, you need a phone with speaker capacity. Because you're meeting in closed session, the only thing that's important is for the board to be able to hear the attorney and for the attorney to be able to hear the board so they can actually have a discussion. And then what is litigation? Well, it's, if you're going to court, if there's a chance you could be going to court, If you're going to an administrative body, like unemployment appeals, that comes up a lot. There could be an issue of, well, somebody's filed for unemployment, should we oppose this or not? That's the decision on whether or not to oppose that could be dealt with under the litigation exemption. Other things that could come up is significant exposure or potential litigation. That's where you think there could be something going on where you could be sued or somebody's threatening to sue you. A little more detail on the next slide as far as what is potential litigation. If the board knows of facts that bring up a chance that you're going to get sued, or a chance that, or on the other side, on a chance that you may need to sue somebody, you can hold a closed session meeting with your attorney to discuss those facts. The other item you can have a closed session on is if you've received a claim. Then of course you can hold a closed session item under litigation to discuss the claim, although in that description on your agenda, you're going to have to list that it's a claim, and you're going to have to list who the claim's been filed by. Or another reason why you might want to have a closed session item is if you've actually been threatened with a lawsuit. If it's a credible threat, then you could certainly hold a closed session item under pending or proposed litigation. Next item that comes up a lot is real property negotiations. And if you're in eminent domain, do you hold that under litigation or real property negotiations? Any guesses? Any guesses? I put it on the slide. If you're in eminent domain, you're in litigation. Now, it's a little bit of a trick question, because in order to get to eminent domain, you have to show that you tried in good faith to negotiate a purchase. So, in reality, what you'll do is you'll have your closed session item where you meet, or prior, in open session, you appoint your property negotiator and you name the parcel that you're seeking to acquire and describe what it is you're trying to buy. Then you're going to go into closed session and you're going to talk to your property negotiator about, look, what terms are we trying to buy this property on, what will we accept, what are we going to offer. You get that settled down. Then if the property negotiator comes back to you, you put it on your agenda again under real property negotiations. You sit down in closed session with your property negotiator, and you may have to do this a few times, but they say, look, we can't reach a deal. We might have to go into eminent domain. From there, that's when, okay, real property negotiations have now stopped. Now we're moving into eminent domain. Once you get into that phase, you're out of real property negotiations, you're into a lawsuit. So then when it comes time for updates between the board and their consultant, then you want to be under litigation. Then there's a whole host of other smaller exemptions that don't come up very often, but they might on occasionally. Public security, that's one that comes up sometimes, fairly regularly. And others that you probably, they don't come logically. Some of these medical health services, you can hear complaints from enrolled members. Well, logically, nobody's going to think about that. But it may be worth, if you've got something strange that comes up and it doesn't fit into personnel, real property, or litigation, it might be worth checking to see if there's any other exemptions that might apply so that you can hold a closed session item on. And if there's no reason, no closed session exempt item available for you to hold that closed session, then you're going to have to list it on the agenda and discuss it in open session. The next thing is that closed session, what's discussed in closed session should stay closed. It should be privileged. It shouldn't be, you shouldn't have your long, heartfelt discussion in closed session, decide what you want to do, or talk about it, go outside and tell your neighbor. No. If it's discussed in closed session, then it needs to stay between the members of the board and their consultants that were in the meeting. Which gets into another point. The only people that should be present for a closed session meeting or a closed session item are people that actually have something to say, or they have a purpose for being there. Some boards might have a specific person that records the minutes. They might be in there. They might have their executive officer, and then they might have the consultant, and then there might be multiple consultants that actually have a purpose for being there. Then they need to be there. But if they're just there because they're 2 more items down on the closed session item, then you should probably ask them to, can you step outside while we finish up this issue? Because the purpose is to try to keep those discussions closed, away from the public, and relatively confidential. So you don't want to invite everybody that happens to be an employee into your closed session meetings. And kind of going along with that, just because it's discussed in closed session doesn't make information confidential. It has to be confidential information. If during a closed session you discuss the information that was on your budget report that was listed on the open item, in open session, and available on the table, well, your budget report doesn't become confidential. If during that meeting you were, say, discussing potential litigation, that part's confidential, but the budget, no. If it's something that's otherwise available and open to the public, just because you talked about it in a closed session, it doesn't make it confidential. And then there's basically a whistleblower exception. If you as a board member are concerned that there's an illegal action being taken, and you feel you need to discuss that with a grand jury or the authorities, then you can discuss the contents of the closed session to them if you've got a legitimate concern that something illegal is going on. Going into reporting, if you've got your minute book that you've got for open session, and then at the end of your open session you move on into closed session, and you just keep with that same minute book, that's not a good idea. You need to have a separate minute book for your closed session meetings. Because you don't want your closed session minute book to be switched with your open session minute book, because your closed session items need to be kept confidential. So if you are recording the minutes in the closed session, then that should be done separately and not made publicly available the same way your minutes during open session are. And the other big item is reporting. All your items, all of your decisions have to be reported. So that includes the actions that you might take in closed session. But what comes out is, well, when do we have to report it? Specifically, a lot of times for real property negotiations, you might hold your vote and decide, okay, we're going to make an offer for $150,000. We authorize you to go $150,000, and if he's got reasons to do a counter, we'll let you go up to $175,000. Well, you don't want to come out of your closed session and then in your report say that we voted 5-0 to authorize our negotiating team to make an offer at $150,000 and to accept a counter offer for up to $175,000. Because if the person you're trying to buy the property from is paying attention, they'll look at your minutes, see that they're on it, and then see what the items were reported on and say, oh, I'm going to ask for $175,000. So, and under that scenario, you took your vote, you authorized your negotiator, but your action is not final. So you report on final actions. The action that you took is not final. Now, if your negotiator goes out and closes the deal, then after the deal's closed at a later meeting, you're going to report that you authorized the purchase of this property at whatever amount that it was actually purchased for. Because once the deal's been made, then your decision that you made is now final. So now it's something that you have to report. When it comes to litigation, if you made the decision, okay, here's our same scenario. You say a settlement offer. Well, you don't want to report what your settlement offer is, because it's not final. It's not final unless the settlement offer has been made and then it's accepted. Then it becomes final. Then at a later meeting, it's reported on what the board decided and what the decision actually was. Any questions?
I'd like to revitalize again. Just want to hear about something that.
Now the question is, when disciplinary matters must be discussed in open session, why hang out an employee problem to the public? Well, they're only to be discussed in open session if the employee asks them to be. So if you give a notice and then the employee says, I want that heard in open session, then you have to, because the employee is asking you to have that complaint heard in open session. If the employee says, no, I want that heard in closed session, you hear it in closed session. Okay. Next one, who takes the minutes for closed session? Well, my experience generally, the executive officer will also be writing down the minutes. Otherwise, it's a small meeting where you might only have just 5 people or 5 or 7 people or however many that are on the board. One person will keep track of what's being, kind of a rough discussion of what's being discussed and keep a tally of what the votes are. So if the secretary is not allowed to sit in the closed session, well, and then the other exception is they might have a specific person identified to keep track of the minutes in a closed session. Usually it's, like I said, it's either a management person that's going to be in the closed session anyway, or a member of the district. And should closed minutes be sealed? I suppose, I'm not sure what you mean by sealed, but the idea is to keep the closed session minutes separate and not available to the public. Of course, if somebody, if a court eventually asks you for them, you might have to reveal them. But otherwise, you want to keep them separate. So I suppose you could keep them, if by sealed you mean keep them in a locked filing cabinet? Yes. What if an employee requests an open session meeting regarding his or her disciplinary matters? Well, then you have to have an open session. How should open to the public meeting be handled by the board since the public is present or may be present? Well, you're going to have it. Under that scenario, you have to post your agenda 72 hours in advance. And on the agenda, it's going to have that item listed for that employee. So if you posted your agenda, and then again, 24 hours, at least 24 hours, you gave that employee the notice that you're going to be discussing a misconduct charge, and they say, I want to have that in open session. Then when you meet at the time and place and date that you put on your posted agenda, you open it up, you're in open session, and you stay that way. When you get to that item, you report that it was listed as a closed session item, but the employee has asked for it to be held in open session. Kind of as a matter of course, you could ask the employee if they still want held in open session. Employee says yes, you move forward, and you just hold your hearing as you would in closed session, except now it's open to the public. Did that answer your question? I don't know who asked it. Okay. So, when minutes are tight, there should be one set which is only open session and one set for closed session. You should really just keep them separate. I'm not sure if you're keeping them like if you've got a tape recorder and you're tape recording the open session, what you may want to do is, well, one thing you do is you turn the tape recorder off during closed session. If you really need the help, then you should probably switch the tape. If you really just absolutely have to have the minutes taped before you can write them. But my advice would be not to take the closed session at all, and just take notes. Just take handwritten notes. And then when you're taking those handwritten notes, make sure you're taking them on something different than what you took the open session on. So if you got one pad for open session, once it's done, you put that pad away, you take out a separate pad, closed session, you put the date down, and you take your minute, then you take your notes for the closed session meeting. So the idea is to keep them separate, so they don't get lumped together. Did that answer the question? Shaking your head now? No? Disciplinary action against another board member. Another board member, that goes along with the contractor. If you're taking a disciplinary action against another board member, he or she is an elected official, not an employee. You can't do that under the personnel exemption. So conceivably, you got to do it in an open session because personnel is not available. Personnel exemption is not available. Was that what you were asking about? I'm not saying any head nods, but I'm going to assume that was a yes. Okay. It's a bad thing with cards. You can't ask unless they want to take credit for it. You can take credit for it if you want. Next question. Do you have to take minutes in closed session? No. Should they be stored in a computer hard drive? I guess you could. I don't know of any prohibition against keeping them on a computer hard drive if you type up those minutes. I guess in answer to the first part of that question, you can just take, like I said, you can just take handwritten notes of what's going on and then file those separately just to keep them more private. It's generally easier to keep handwritten notes private than it is if you put it on the computer hard drive. If you're networked, then everybody on the network could have access to them. If it's just on that specific computer, anybody that has access to that computer could have them. So I guess generally I think it'd be easier to keep them separate and to keep them private if you just took handwritten notes. But I suppose you could if you had to, or really wanted to, type them up and put them on your computer. I don't know of any prohibition against that. Anybody else? Never heard of one. Next one. If employee okays the closed session, can the employer participate? Can the employee participate in the closed session? Yes. Because if you're talking about a misconduct or you're going to be hearing a specific complaint, then the purpose for notifying the employee and having the employee be there is so that the employee can hear the allegations that are being made against them. And along that due process vein, if the board that is hearing the complaint is acting as the due process official in deciding whether or not to fire the employee or to take disciplinary action against the employee for the alleged misconduct, then the employee has the right to kind of have their side heard. So they get a chance to hear the allegations that are made against them, kind of hear the case, and then they have a rebuttal argument to say that, well, no, I wasn't sleeping, I was meditating, and my doctor says I need to meditate 2 times a day, and here's my doctor's note. Maybe they've got something like that. I've heard strange things. And then our closed session minutes legally required, well, you need to keep track of the decisions. So in a sense, yes, because if the board's voting on something and they're making that decision, you have to keep track of what that decision is, and you should keep track of how the vote went down, whether it was 3-2, 4-1, 1-4, if it got completely shut down. It needs to be tracked that this was made and disproved. So that needs to be tracked because all decisions need to be reported eventually. Eventually that decision, if it's a final decision, the decision needs to be reported. So somebody needs to be keeping track of what that decision actually was. So I guess an answer to the question is you need to keep track of what was decided in the closed session. Next one. If an employee is related to a board member and a closed session meeting is needing to discuss that employee's disciplinary action, should the related director abstain from votes/motions? I think that goes to the first legal disclaimer that we're not supposed to give legal advice during this. That goes into a completely separate issue of whether or not you've got a nepotism issue, whether you've got a nepotism policy. As far as closed session meetings, it isn't really related. That's really kind of a separate item of whether you've got a conflict of interest. I don't know if you've got a conflict of interest.
You didn't include that.
No conflict. You're going to have to come back for Government 103. And well, there goes back to conflict of interest. And next one, if a board member wishes to add something to the agenda within 72 hours or 24 hours. Well, that question was actually kind of briefly touched on by Mr. Farley. If it's an emergency situation, yes, but you've got to meet the Brown Act requirements for an emergency situation. So I guess the response is maybe. Anything else? Any other questions? Oh, I got another one. I'm going to wait because Carla's one of my clients, so she's just trying to get free legal advice, I think. This question, employee closed session action, does it need to be reported if it would harm employee or not at all? Well, final action needs to be reported. Not exactly sure. That question might need a little bit more. That question might need a little bit more facts. If you're taking final action, you need to report the final action. What I guess you might be getting at, and I'll just expound on it, the personnel exemption covers, it doesn't just cover discipline or hearing misconduct charges, it also covers performance evaluations. So you could have a situation where you're meeting in closed session to do a performance evaluation on an employee where you're going to talk generally about a lot of different things that the employee is doing. And under that employee evaluation, if you're really conducting an employee evaluation, then the employee doesn't have to be present, the employee doesn't have to be notified. You're conducting a permitted employee evaluation in closed session. Now I say if it's really an employee evaluation, because I've seen situations where they say, we want to conduct an employee evaluation. Oh, okay, well, what is it that you're going to be evaluating? Well, we've got these allegations that they're sleeping on the job. Well, that's not an employee evaluation. That's considering specific misconduct, and you've got to go under the misconduct rule. But if it's really an employee evaluation, then yes, you can have that in closed session without the employee present and without notifying the employee. And then depending on the action, I mean, the action could be, yes, he's getting a good job, we're going to write this, have this employee evaluation written up and given to him. And I suppose that the action taken would be that employee evaluation completed. But it really kind of depends on the facts of what it is that you're trying to do. Was that all the questions?
We're saving our money.
What?
We're saving our money for you.
Oh, okay.
Great. Thanks so much. As I indicated, we're going to keep right on going, so whenever you need to take a break, just feel free to slip out and